Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I'm your host, Mike Allen. The Roaring Twenties, flappers, rum runners, bootleggers, just some of the terms that entered our lexicon 100 years ago during this country's 13-year experiment with banning alcohol. Yes, Prohibition created some larger-than-life folk heroes, but few were as memorable and frankly as successful at moving booze as Nellie Green. Well, here today to share this woman's absolutely incredible backstory is Mike Burdan. Now, Mike's a writer and historical researcher. He's had a long-time association with the Glastonbury Historical Society, previously serving on its board, and he still manages their publications. Now, Mike's written about Nellie Green. He's going to be along in just a moment. This week's trivia question: the first selectmen of the neighboring towns of Madison, Guilford, and Durham came together for the first time in a decade or so to do this. What did they do? Stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you're going to know the topic for next week's show. Well, these days it seems like the biggest debate over alcohol are all the rules about whether you can sell it in grocery stores or only in official liquor stores. About 100 years ago, the biggest debate over alcohol led to a very rare amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The 18th Amendment outlawed the manufacturing, sale, or transport of booze. It did not, however, prohibit the drinking of liquor. And for many members of the public who remained thirsty in spite of all these legal changes, there were operators of speakeasies. Now, you could go to those illegal bars and get a drink, usually in the basement of some legitimate business or down some alleyway where you'd need a password to get in. You would, though, have to pay handsomely for a drink, and that price reflected the risk that the supplier of the illegal liquid took, namely a few years in prison. Well, Connecticut and Rhode Island were the only two states that did not support the change to the Constitution, and there were an estimated 1,500 speakeasies in Connecticut alone between 1920 and 1933. That's the year the Prohibition was repealed. Now, during these 13 years, one of the most infamous rum runners and bootleggers was Nellie Green of East Haven. She became quite wealthy at her resort hotel and bar, tending to those souls who would pay the price for a drink. Now, here to tell us about this decidedly colorful figure is a man who's studied Nellie, spoken in fact to her family members, and then written about her. His name is Mike Burdan. So, Mike, I want to start off talking about what I would call this dichotomy between Nellie Green, who everybody seems to know of as the queen of the rum runners and, the great Irish Rose of East Haven, but she as a child was much different. I mean, on one hand, she was a boxer even, and she was also an operatic singer. Can you sort all this out for us?
Oh, sure. She had a very colorful, almost frontier-like upbringing, but the father owned 750 acres of land alongside the Farm River in East Haven, and he made his living off of the land, hunting small game, waterfowl, clamming, crabbing, cutting firewood, kindling. He was a mason by trade, but apparently his injury in the Civil War, he was a drummer boy and was hit in the forehead. It left an indentation that was immediately apparent to anyone who looked at him from a ricocheting mini ball. It kind of kept him from really being a full mason. He preferred this outdoor life, and he brought up his daughter, and apparently his only child, to be a tomboy, to learn how to crab, to learn to clam, to cut firewood, to do all the things that he did when he wasn't quite able to do it, or to help him out around the home. She just happened to have been blessed with a fine voice and fairly successfully have a 2-year career with a touring opera company out of New York.
Now, one of her dad's, I guess you would call it habits, was to settle disputes in a fisticuffs manner, and he taught her that too?
Yes, that was the way Charles Green handled his personal conflicts and his business relations, was with fists. Almost invariably came out on top. And figuring that that was a good skill for his daughter to have, he taught her how to box as well.
Did I hear the story right that one time she was riding through and I guess some guy made some salacious comment to her and she took matters into her own hands?
Yes, that apparently happened quite early on, probably was a teenager. She was riding through New Haven, and it was a salacious remark, apparently directed at her ample figure, which was noted by just about everybody, and her long golden hair. And she dismounted in a short order, horsewhipped the individual who was, quite surprised to be receiving this treatment from a woman horse rider, and took him right over to the local police and turned him in, saying, "If you need me, you know where to find me."
Now, as often happened in those years, and Nellie was no different, she got married at an age that some might consider young in these years, of age of about 16 or 17. And tell us about her first husband.
Yeah, her first husband's name was Charles Hinckley. He was 6 years her senior. He apparently was a business relation or came to meet Nellie via her father, but proverbially swept Nellie off her feet or gave her the opportunity to get away from a rather constrictive house life, having to fill in for her father, who was not a good businessman, and increasingly care for her mother, who was going increasingly blind. It looked like there was an opportunity for her to get her own life. And so she went and married Charles Hinckley after what is defined or described as a rather brief courtship.
And then she ends up finding out a horrible situation with him when he goes out fishing on Long Island Sound. What happened?
They had set up house in the Green family residence, and life looked like it was settling down for her until one day in October of 1895, Hinckley goes out fishing and just doesn't come back. It wasn't until a week later that they found his bloated body floating along the shore. Allegedly, her father was the one who found it, and that didn't do anything for his mental state, certainly didn't do anything for Nellie's as well.
So now she decides that she's going to take this opportunity and get out and try and make a run of it as an opera singer, right?
That is correct, yes. She has always had a good voice, but this was her one chance, and she goes out and gets herself hired by the Whitney Opera Company out of New York. They were a traveling company that went up and down the East Coast. Nellie stayed with them for 2 years until essentially she got the word that the situation at home had deteriorated to the point that she really couldn't be away any longer. Her mother was increasingly blind and unable to even look after herself. And the father at this point is now going increasingly, well, insane, to use what was probably an accurate word for him.
So now she comes home to take care of her family, gives up her operatic career, and she knew a guy growing up from New Haven, I guess a very prominent family in New Haven, and she ends up now, this guy will become her second husband.
Yes, that is correct. Yes. Nellie leaves the opera company. Her father, who has to be institutionalized, dies in November of 1899, and Nellie marries William Barnes Talmadge, who she had known as a child, in May of 1900. So there was only about a 6 month gap between the death of her father and her marriage to Bill Talmadge.
Now they grow this business. They make the most out of this 750 acres of land, starting with the Green residence, which they expand and turned into the Talmadge Hotel, right?
Yes, Bill Talmadge is apparently a very nice guy, but he was never much of a go-getter. According to the 1900 census, he was a driver for a feed and grain business. Nellie had a lot more ambition than that. And it was her idea, apparently, to convert or to really expand the kind of rundown family homestead right there along the Farm River and turn it into a 25-room hotel with a dining area, a large bar room, and a marina.
So now she also has the wherewithal and the foresight to not just put all of her money into this expanded house, tavern slash restaurant bar, or the marina. She also puts together a beverage bottling company and a coal delivery company.
Well, yes, the Hotel Talmadge, and although that was its official name, everyone knew it as Nellie Green's, was a summer resort. They did not do much business in the winter, if any at all, other than serving the locals some drinks and food. So they have a bunch of other businesses that they get into. There was the Talmadge Coal Company, which was able to use their dock to land and distribute coal. They went into the boatyard business, where they would actually repair boats and then manufacture a few, which would come in very handy later. And they even did that small soft drink bottling company called the Old Bridge Beverage Company.
So now they open up the Talmadge Hotel and the resort center in roughly 1901, and then roughly 2 decades later, Prohibition is passed. So she's had 20 years to start serving customers drinks and whatnot and getting return customers and some pretty big name people coming and spending a week there. And suddenly she, like every bar owner in the country at that point, had to make a decision. We're just going to throw in the towel and say, okay, you win. We're not going to serve alcohol. Or we're going to be a little crafty and find a way to keep our customers happy and full of alcohol. And she chose the latter, didn't she?
She did indeed. I have to imagine it was a very calculated business opportunity decision. Prohibition became the law of the land in January of 1919, but it didn't go into effect for a full year, according to the Volstead Act. So they had a full year to decide what they were going to do, and Nellie and Bill combined apparently decided that they were just going to take their chances and go into the speakeasy business, use the restaurant's long-standing clientele, its cover as a boatyard, to kind of skirt the law on prohibition. And part of the reason, I have to imagine, was the fact that their only child, Charles, had been diagnosed with polio and was needing increasingly more care and expensive treatment. So there was a financial drain. Nellie and Bill probably could have gotten through prohibition on their other businesses, their legitimate businesses, but prohibition offered them the opportunity to make a killing.
So now here they have this, what I would consider, you talk about real estate location, location, location. They've got a great location, right? They're inland from Long Island Sound by roughly a half mile, and you've got the 3 mile international limit where alcohol can sit 3 miles and 1 foot outside, and there's nothing that anybody can do about it. And then they transfer the liquor off those big boats, bring them into Long Island Sound, and then up and into these little areas like Nellie Green had in this Farm River location of hers, right?
Yes, and this is where their boatyard came in very handy. They were able to build their own rum runner boats, 60 foot long. They had no decks on them. They ran very low in the water, and they were powered by World War I surplus V12 Liberty engines. They were faster than anything the Coast Guard had, and they would only have to race 3 miles to get to shore. And because they were low in the water, they could navigate the estuary. The Farm River has about a tidal range of 7 feet. So you really have to know what you're doing going up that. And they were able to take advantage of that skill. That worked out very well for them.
Now, there are stories abounding about the illicit rum runner trade in Long Island Sound, and a lot of times they actually involve the people who were running the rum taking pot shots, firing at the Coast Guard who were chasing them. But this would never happen on a Nellie Green boat, would it?
No, well, it would never happen because she did not allow her rum runners, the actual people on the boats, to carry guns. If you got involved with a shootout, you have a whole nother level of offenses. And she knew that her boats were faster than anything the Coast Guard had. It was just a matter of timing. All the unloading was done at night. They really didn't have many encounters with the Coast Guard except for one in particular.
Well, now you've got to tell me about that one.
Yes. Okay. The first thing to know about this little example, and I can tell you the date was March 22nd, 1924. Nellie was heading out of town. in the days leading up to her departure, she noticed something what she considered to be very suspicious, and that was a new work crew. 2 or 3 of the members of the crew were wearing street shoes, not the kind of worker boots that you would anticipate. So she notified her staff that don't do anything, don't bring in any more hooch until I give the all clear on this. Well, unfortunately, one of her captains, he just got antsy. He just wanted to get the hooch in. It turns out it was 120 cases. And so he did not wait for the all clear signal. And sure enough, Nellie's premonition or her observations were correct. They were federal agents. They were waiting for him, and they caught him right at the Talmadge dock. Now, Nellie was not there, so she could not get charged. Captain Ryder was given 6 months in jail, or at least a sentence of it, and fined $350. And that seems to be the only time that Nellie ever got caught, or Nellie's crew ever got caught.
Now, there's another famous story where they got, I think, a little bit of a heads up and started burying some of the stuff in the cornfield.
The Talmadge Hotel, a.k.a. Nellie Green's, was frequently raided. That was a given. They normally got heads up because they were in close contact, by which I mean money was changing hands between Nellie and the East Haven police. So they were pretty well prepared for raids, but every now and then one would catch them. And on this particular occasion to which you're alluding, they would move the liquor, which was generally stored behind a false wall, into the basement, and they buried it out in one of the pastures. Well, it was summer, and beer will expand with hot weather, and apparently the bottles started popping and blowing up, but fortunately the federal agents were not out in the pasture when that happened.
So now finally, as all good things come to an end, so did Prohibition in 1933, and this turned Nellie back into a legitimate businesswoman in terms of tending her bar and whatnot. And she kept going, and I want to talk about some of her traits. Like, she would sometimes sing to the patrons, and she carried a riding crop with her. Could you tell us about that side of her?
Yes, a long riding coat, a derby hat, and a riding crop. And she did not hesitate to at least threaten to use the riding crop. She had a thing for foul language, surprisingly, not a thing for alcohol. She herself, at one point in 1906, was arrested in New Haven for drunkenness and sentenced to 15 days in jail. But she did not like foul language, and she ran a very tight ship, a polite ship. That's how she maintained her own order there.
She ends up passing away in the early 1950s, and a friend of her son's took over management of the facility, and it took on an entirely different twist, didn't it?
After Prohibition was over, Nellie's had a very nice reputation as, a great place to go. And she started catering to the theatrical crowd, which would come out from New Haven, New York, spend a couple of nights there, maybe even a week. And that was very good for business as well, even though she was, we're talking now in the midst of the Depression. Charles, her son, dies in 1942. He had partially helped out running the place, but gotten into financial trouble because he had a proclivity for betting on the ponies and generally losing. But he dies in 42, and so his widow, by the name of Betty, takes over, and she hires a guy by the name of Bunny Horton. Bunny Horton was a friend of Charles. He was in the auto business, a salesman by profession. And he apparently does a very good job of running the operation, though he had some decidedly different ideas on which way to take it after Nellie died in 1951. And he turned it into a nightclub. He did have some very legitimate acts would show up out there. But then later on, it got sleazier and sleazier. And, some of your listeners will remember Nellie Green's as being a burlesque show. And that was all under Bunny Horton's leadership long after Nellie and her husband were gone.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. There is actually a Nellie Green's restaurant in Brantford today, not far from where the fabled original establishment itself once stood. However, it is not associated at all with the family. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Mike Burdan, writer and historical researcher who has studied and written about the infamous Queen of the Rum Runners, Nellie Green. Well, the answer to this week's trivia question. The question was, the first selectmen of the neighboring towns of Madison, Guilford, and Durham came together for the first time in a decade or so to do this. What did they do? Well, the answer is they walked the borders of their towns and then came together where their three towns meet at one particular point. Why'd they do this? Well, next week on Amazing Tales, we're going to speak with the first selectman of Madison, and she will straighten out all of this for us. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.